our duty is not to live for self. Our duty is to create a better world for the next generations and to pass on to the next generations. We cannot have this nihilistic sense of self that I think is expressed in the pro-choice movement. But yeah, I think a woman's right in the pro-choice movement outweighs a woman and man's responsibility, which is, again, to protect and to care for those who are vulnerable, which are children in the womb.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, now, does the Bible portray children as a real nuisance, or does it even display them as a distraction from a lively life?
No, children are portrayed as a blessing from the Lord. Now, you look through Genesis and you see a number of women who are barren, at least for a time, and you see that as the outworking of God's plan. It's clear God's the one who's given Sarah a child, that he's given Rebecca, Rachel. He intervenes. And you just see this pattern emerge. And some of them is just cultural stuff that's going on. But women, you think of Hannah as well, Samuel's mother, and there's this great shame associated with not having a child and carrying on the family and receiving the blessings of the Lord and having a place in, to receive his promises. Some of that may have been cultural, but you think in the Psalms as well that the children are a blessing from the Lord. The one who's got his quiver full of them. There's joy, and so overall, yes, children are portrayed positively as something to be received with thanksgiving, but also blessings that need to be taught and nurtured from the Lord. It recognizes the sin that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. It doesn't come out and say, and so therefore you're going to have a headache sometimes because of your child. But it is implicit that because the foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child and the need to use the rod to drive the foolishness far from him and these kinds of things, that there is going to be, and even in the curse, Genesis 3, wrapped up in childbearing, that there is going to be pain associated with children.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, especially that quote of Psalm 127, 3-5. I think it's so definitively answers. I will say, in asking, does the Bible portray them as a nuisance or distraction? I think in one small sense it might, but, in a context you have to really understand. So Apostle Paul does refer to, he encourages some people not to marry. And I think I interpret that as referring to a specific situation where persecution was coming and it was harder for the gospel witness to basically have kids because in the first century world, especially if you're, and even today to some degree, if you're pro-life, that means you have at least a possibility of having kids. And having kids hinders the ability to share the gospel and go on missions work sometimes. It just does. I think in that context, maybe it sees it as a slight limitation sometimes in certain situations on ministry. But apart from this, it very much sees, them as a blessing, as a heritage that from the very Lord himself. And I think it's fascinating because Christianity, really, the Bible stands out from almost every other religion for this strong statement of valuation of children, and the way that really I can't think of any other religion that's at least not based upon the Bible in some way, shape, or form that values children in this kind of way.
Yeah, the Bible is butting up against cultural assumptions all over the place, of different kinds of cultures.
And how does Jesus especially show us a shocking valuation of inconvenient children? Well,
Jesus welcomes them. He touches them. He blesses them. He humbles himself to take up time with them. When people are bringing their children for Jesus to touch them, even they're wanting some sort of blessing. They may not fully get who he is, but they want their children. So this shows they value their children in some way, and they want Jesus to bless. Maybe they sort of akin to TV preachers and, come touch the baby or touch the TV screen and heal you. I don't know all their motives. It doesn't tell us. But Jesus is very humble because they don't offer him anything. It's not like he stands to gain and from them, and so he's just puts himself low. And I mean, you're talking about someone who, in his underwear, washed his disciples' feet, and he's washing dirt and animal dung and things like this off their feet. And so you can just see another example of Jesus' humility. God is a humble God, even though he's glorious and exalted. And so it is remarkable to see the Lord of the universe sitting there with children on his lap and, just, I guess, hanging out in a way when, there's important teaching to do and healing and things like this. And he's sitting there just, akin to playing with a kid on the rug or something.
Yeah, so, I mean, that Jesus interacting with children, the welcoming children, I mean, that's just such an important passage. And there's so many keys in that we ignore. And I think the one I often refer to is Mark 10:13-15 in that. And what really stands out to me, in addition to some of the things that you pointed out, is that the disciples actually rebuked. They tried to rebuke Jesus. They tried to rebuke as well as the parents and even the children potentially, for all of this happening, for Jesus welcoming the children in. And one of the reasons why, I mean, was because the leaders at that time really didn't lower themselves in the way that Jesus did. It was seen as beneath a leader. I mean, if a king, a Roman that emperor, is never going to lower himself to be with these dirty, rotten, scoundrel kids that literally might be dirty, kids. But Jesus rebukes back. He rebukes the disciples, their attitude of not valuing kids. He rebuked this idea that kids are a distraction, to ministry, which is such a statement, because I don't think he's trying to argue with the mentality that kids get in the way, and that kids are, in senses that kids are loud, and kids, that kids don't make things go as planned. But he's saying, nope, that's fine. That's how God's created them. That's how my Father has created them, and we must value them. And I think even what's to me really extreme is because, again, this was basically a congregational gathering to listen to Jesus and to be healed by Jesus. This religious experience that the disciples thought was reserved just for adults. And he welcomed these children to the same religious experience that he welcomed adults to, which I think is such an outstanding, powerful statement.
Mm. Yeah, those are really good points. When you think of it, just the foolishness of the disciples. And, Peter, a few chapters before in Mark, rebuked Jesus for talking about going to the cross. He's like, no, Lord, never. And, Jesus, get behind me, Satan. And so it is quite the contrast. And just in that section in Mark, there's a couple of places where Jesus is dealing with children. He talks about receiving the kingdom as a child. And it's just very clear that he is value. And also in that context, he deals with the question of divorce and the treatment of women. And so Jesus is making it a point, and Mark is highlighting it, the Lord values those who are not valued as much by society, who are weaker, who, don't, in their eyes, have as much to offer. Yeah,
absolutely. How is, or at least was, raising up children obedience to God's universal human decree?
Well, in Genesis 1, God makes the couple, and then the first recorded words there in chapter 1 are be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so you've got people who have not fallen into sin yet. They've got perfect love for God, perfect love for each other. And so they're in right relationship to him. So the implication is that they're going to make worshipers, more people who are in right relationship to him. They're going to teach them, the one thing: stay away from the tree, but hey, let's fill the earth. Let's take dominion over it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, these kinds of things. And so that was the pattern for humanity. That God would fill, because the Garden of Eden was cultivated, but you see that they were supposed to expand the borders of the garden, so to speak, and cultivate that, bring it under dominion.
Yeah.
And so we don't know how long it took, but that they rebelled against that and rebelled against the Lord himself. So, but that's where it comes from. I mean, that's God's intention for the family.
That's great. So it's interesting. I phrased that question like when I said at least was, because I actually do think exegetically, like analyzing the text and it's looking at the New Testament, I think the command overtly that you must have children. You must have even decently big families, which I think is overtly the command in the Old Testament under the Old Covenant. I think it is more or less fulfilled and not really held over Christians. I think it was, to fill the earth. And the way that, we have people in most places on the planet Earth. There are still places that are more or less desolate. But I think in a way this has been fulfilled. In a way, this earth has been populated because of God's command. That doesn't mean that we don't continue the act, but I think that there's no command that all Christians therefore must obey in having huge families. But I do think this does show us that we were made to perpetuate the image of God. That's part of having the image of God, is being made to perpetuate that image. In fact, I think part of the image of God is actually being a creator, just as God is a creator. And being fully human then, being truly a fulfillment of what humanity is meant to be, is participating in this creating, through creating a next generation. So in that, I think having kids is very much God glorifying. It's worship to have kids.
It's a really good point.
How is having children, though, one of the best ways Christians have actually fulfilled the Great Commission?
Well, even, and if, what you were talking about brings out the usefulness of biblical theology, seeing, what related to different covenants and this kind of thing. But by having children themselves and sharing the gospel with those children, calling them to Christ, to repent and believe, and then living out the implications in their lives, teaching them to observe what Jesus commanded, and doing that together as a family, involving them in the life of the church. And then they repeat the process, and then they repeat the process. Because you mentioned earlier there may be some minor ways that having children would cramp your ability to reach out to other people. And yes, I agree that particularly when your children are small and just they are needy, and you think of just mealtime with small children, that can be a stressful time. And so you invite the neighbors over and they get hit with food or something. It can just be, even if the child is not causing problems like that, but just trying to have a conversation with someone. But you have these unbelievers born into your family that you have the opportunity to pass on Christ to in his ways day in and day out, that you don't have with your neighbors or coworker or something like that. And so, that in large part, the church has been perpetuated that way.
Yeah, absolutely. By far that way, really. And we can see it as a bad thing, but praise God. We have so many more gospel opportunities of sharing the gospel with our kids than we would have for anybody. Even our closest friends. We have so many great evangelism opportunities that we wouldn't have if we didn't have kids. But further, I think they also perpetuate the Great Commission by, gospel-centered parents that disciple their own kids. Oftentimes, by God's grace, can lead to gospel-centered kids that go out and share the gospel. We equip them through our discipleship, through our raising up, and even having children, to raise up people, young people that will reach the next generations for Jesus. There would hardly be effective missionaries if there weren't a great deal of godly Christian parents that were behind those effective missionaries and discipling them as they were raised up.
Absolutely.
So, does this mean, though, that people are incomplete without kids, that they're just kind of partially human if they don't have kids?
No. Genesis 1, in fact, the man and the woman were both made in God's image. The text is clear about that. You made them male and female. And so even in marriage itself, that's not like it completed them. It is a unique relationship, and it does mirror things with the Lord. But that doesn't mean that someone is lacking full personhood or the image of God in some way if they're not married or if they don't have children. And so while that is ordinarily what God intends for people, it's not in every case. And